But this is our wonderful, the wonderful reference library, if I could just scan it for a minute, here in the LaPorte County Historical Society.
Library here, because we've had a chance to expand it from what it was when we were downtown in the county complex.
And I know that over on your shelves here, you said there are actually some binders of all the cemetery records.
Early in the 1960s, the DAR, we're not real sure what they did. We're not sure if they walked the cemeteries and read the stones or not, because I found that there are a lot of stones in our cemetery that they're not included in these lists. And particularly children, they kind of overlook children's graves. So if you have a child that you're researching, you should really check the cemetery anyway, because they may not be in these files. But we have binders here that have the listings that were done in the 1960s by the DAR, whether they read the cemeteries or used the records or used church records or what they used to make these. I'm not sure. They never explained to us how they did it. But they're here and they're valuable, but you have to you can't use these as documents because they were read from old stones, where sometimes they could read a 3 as an 8.
Oh, sure.
It's very easy to do that today because the stones have eroded so from the weather, and so you have to be very careful, but there's certainly very good clues. If you find a listing of an ancestor or whoever you're researching, then you can go to the people who maintain the records and they can give you more definitive information, and then you can go out to cemetery. They can tell you where the burials are, and you can go out to the cemetery and maybe photograph the stones and make a record if you're doing family research. Everybody wants a picture of their ancestors' gravestones, so be sure and do that, but don't take this as being documented fact, because it isn't. But they're very good clues, very good things for people to use to find their ancestors. We also have an extensive obituary file. These are very valuable too, in conjunction with cemetery records. This came to us from a gentleman who, for just his own personal reason, collected the obituaries out of the newspaper starting in about the 1930s. And it's not a complete set of obituaries, but they're very helpful if you don't know the death date of your individual. You can come here and see if we have a copy of the obituary, then you can get the death date, then you can go from there to do more research. But they're very, very valuable. Obituaries are very helpful for people doing family search or any kind of research. If you're even researching a house or any business or anything, and somebody involved in that business, you want to know more about them, come and check out and see if we have an obituary.
Well, that's very helpful to know. And I'd like to go back about a minute ago. You mentioned about the natural erosion and kind of destructive process to a lot of the headstones and the grave sites. And being that this video is about the preservation and restoration of those sites, if we could talk a minute about, there are some laws about that, but there are also just a lot of community organizations that try to keep up with these destructive processes. So could you please talk about that for a minute?
Well, basically the stones in the cemetery belong to the family. And also cemeteries are notably not wealthy. And they're responsible for the perpetual care of the cemetery. By that, it basically means that they have to keep it mowed and trimmed. Not park-like, but at least to keep it so that it's presentable.
Sure, not overgrown. And
right, and so you have the wrong kinds of weeds taking over the cemetery and demolishing the cemetery. But, and for the most part in our county, our cemeteries are well cared for to that point. We have some stones that have fallen over, and the reason for that is that years ago they didn't put bases under stones. And the ground settled, the stones fell over. Or something hit them, a tree fell. Lots of trees in cemeteries have caused a lot of damage. And then of course we've had the vandalism. But most of the cemeteries, they do the best they can do with the finances that they have. There are companies who will come in and actually restore things, but they're pricey. And most cemeteries can't afford to have them done. Some have done a little bit, what they can afford, and they're doing a piecemeal, which is great, but they can't just go into a cemetery like Patton or Pine Lake and do every stone that needs to be fixed, because it would be cost prohibitive. But they are trying to do the best they can do to rehab some of the stones and make them so they'll be around for years to come. But there's a fine company in Nashville, Indiana that has done a lot of work here in LaPorte County on the restoration. They call themselves the Stone Huggers.
Oh.
And they're very good at what they do. They just recently did a lot of work in the little Jewish cemetery next to Patton Cemetery.
Oh, yes.
If you happen to go out that way, you might like to look. There was considerable vandalism in that cemetery last winter.
That's too bad.
And they have had all the stones repaired that were damaged. Done a remarkable job of fixing them. Township trustees are responsible for some of the cemeteries in their townships, and they've undertaken and budgeted money to have some of their cemeteries. I know Low Cemetery in Cool Spring Township on Johnson Road, the township trustee budgeted money to have the stones repaired there. Springfield Township trustee has done some restoration with his budget, and it just depends on where the money can be found to do it with. But
I'm sure that's true.
There are a lot of stones that need some help, and it's just a matter of money and being able to get somebody to do the work. And it's just like anything else, you know. There's some who do a good job and some who don't, but that we've learned that the stone huggers are exceptionally good at what they do. And as I say, they're pricey, but you pay for what you get, you know. But I think that they'll probably never have all of our stones like they were. Many of them have eroded to the point where they just cannot be brought back.
Sure.
You take a stone that's been out in the weather since 1835, 1834. That's a long time for it to withstand the weather that we have here in LaPorte County, except last winter, which was an unusual one. But those old stones have really taken a beating, and many of them are illegible. You can read parts of the information on them, but you'll never be able to read the rest of it. And if there aren't any records, and some cemeteries, their records are lost, or they never did have them or can't find them, there's just no way of telling what should be on that stone so that they could even maybe replace some of it. But those old stones, a lot of people have replaced those old stones with new stones too. Family members have put new granite stones on, which of course granite will be here forever. But that's relatively few people have done that. And another thing is too, there are very few descendants in some cases to take care of some of these things. Many families have just disappeared. And who are they? We don't even know who the responsible person is for the grave. I know we have some graves in Pine Lake Cemetery where people bought like 14 or 21 graves initially, and only maybe a few of them are used, but we have no way of finding out who the people are or where the descendants may be. And that's true of many cemeteries. So it's the cemetery business is a unique business. It's a non-profit organization, definitely. But I know in LaPorte County, I think we do an exceptional job of caring for our cemeteries with the monies we have to do with.
But what you mentioned brings up exactly about the restoration and preservation idea that we're talking about, and that is if community groups wanted to get involved, what would be the best way? You know, Boy Scouts or just some other group, if they wanted to get involved, what would be their first best
well, the first of all, you have to have a leader, somebody who's going to organize these things. They've talked, I know, about getting a board back at Patton Cemetery, but there's got to be somebody in the leadership role to get that organized. And then maybe if they did that, maybe they could get community groups to help. I don't know. That would be, there again, it's not always easy to get volunteers.
I know that years past, in your archives, I saw clippings of some groups that have come in and done some work, and I didn't know how exactly they could go about then starting out, if they would have to contact the caretaker.
Well, yeah,
and
they would have to, but generally it's the other way around. The caretaker contacts them, and organizes because it's up to whoever's operating the cemetery when they can utilize these people.
Sure.
People just can't walk into a cemetery and start a job. They've got to have, the people who operate the cemetery need to know what's going on in their cemetery.
Sure, there are probably legalities involved, and
so if you've got a board, then the board could get a hold of, say, the Boy Scouts, or some of the like the Legion or the Veterans of Foreign Wars. They've done a lot, I know, in Walkerton, but it's up to the leadership of the cemetery to contact a group to see what they could do to help do something in the cemetery, not vice versa.
Sure.
Although, if you've got a Boy Scout group that has maybe a project that they would like to do, they could contact whoever's in charge and see if they could do it. But they can't just go in and do it.
Sure. They need permission.
It has to be by permission.
Sure.
No one should do anything in a cemetery that the laws and the policies of the cemetery don't allow you to do.
Oh, sure. And I'm sure that
cemeteries have signs posted as to what you're allowed to do. You can't plant things sometimes on some of the graves and this sort of thing. Years ago they let people do just about anything they wanted to, but now there are rules. We found it. I always call it the puppy syndrome. People didn't realize that trees grew, so they planted a tree, and now what's happened is the roots of the trees have undermined graves. And this has happened in a lot of cemeteries, and that's what I call the puppy syndrome. They didn't realize the tree was going to grow up. So you have to find out what the rules and regulations are at the cemetery before you do any kind of a project.